Hi everybody and welcome back to another Tonight Talk. Today we've got one of our final talks in our series on Mythbusting, and we're going to be looking at supporting neurodivergent children and young people with grief and bereavement. We're very fortunate again to have Kath Bailey joining us, who's a senior educational psychologist, to be giving us a little overview on this topic. Just before we start, guys, I know this is a really sensitive topic, so please, take care of yourselves and be mindful of your own emotions as you're going through this. You can always pause and come back to the video at any time. Before we start, Kath, would you mind giving us a little intro into what we're going to be discussing today?
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. So just like other children, those with neurodivergent differences will need their grief both recognised and understood, and opportunities to express how they feel. Because of the nature of their difficulties or differences, neurodivergent children and young people may not respond to the death of someone close to them in the same way as other children. But this does certainly not mean that they are not grieving. In this podcast, we will discuss how the experience of grief may be different and how we can best support those children and young people who have suffered a bereavement.
Thank you, Kath. So just to start us off, how can neurodivergent children and people differ in their response to grief? And I suppose, why is there a difference? Surely grief is grief.
Yeah, so every person's experience of death, suffering a bereavement, and their response to it is individual, whether they have a neurodivergent difference or not. I think that's really important to remember, that there can be no judgment on what an individual experiences or needs. Any approach will need to be adapted for the child or young person, depending on their age and level of understanding. However, there can be differences on how neurodivergent children and young people respond. And it is important to be aware of this, as their responses could easily be misconstrued as unsympathetic, lacking in feeling, or uncaring. One of the issues can relate to specific differences in conceptualising death and the rituals surround it as a result of their information processing differences and differences in understanding hypothetical events. Excuse me. Other differences may relate but are not specific to mind blindness. As we know, this is a difference in understanding things from another's point of view. So this may make it hard for the child or young person to understand others' feelings and behaviours and fail to realise that others may be able to help. There may be differences in the way they process information. So children and young people may have differences in understanding the rituals surrounding a death and in understanding the implications of a death. For example, that because someone has died, this means they will not be there at the weekend to take them to school or be there to celebrate a birthday. Language and communication also needs to be considered. The child or young person may have difficulty understanding the abstract concepts involved unless others use clear, specific and concrete language. And children and young people may have to communicate their feelings or ask for support in a different way. It is also worth noting that any preoccupations may become exacerbated or more intense due to higher levels of anxiety that they may be experiencing at this particular time. Issues around imagination, perception of time and memory may lead to a difference in understanding the impact of death. For example, changes to routines and anticipating how things might be in the future, and in comprehending events outside their previous experience. As well as suffering the loss of the person that has died, neurodivergent children and young people can be further distressed by all the changes that might happen in their day-to-day lives as a result of the bereavement.
Okay. So I'm wondering then, because we know that, death isn't always something that is something kind of sudden, what should we do if we know that a death of someone is expected? How should we prepare our young people for that?
Okay, yeah. So if it's known that the death of someone close is expected, children and young people can be prepared in advance and in a more gradual way. The child may need to be prepared for visits to a hospice or hospital, for example. In these circumstances, it is particularly helpful if they can be forewarned of changes, for example, in the ill person's appearance, relating to how they may sound, look, feel to the touch, etc., or for any other changes in everyday activities and routines that might result. It is also really important to try to keep to normal daily routines as much as possible. It's also really important to use clear, concrete language, avoiding euphemisms and abstract ideas, which can cause confusion. It's also helpful to explain any predicted changes in routine in advance by giving details about who will be doing what and when. Pictures and photographs can be helpful to explain what will happen, when and how. For example, of the hospice, of the taxi that will take him to the school or swimming lesson from now on, for example. Using calendars or other visual means, say to chart hospital visits, also including significant positive events such as visits to the park, can be helpful. It's also useful to develop rituals to mark death, such as lighting a candle when an animal dies. The same ritual can then be used when a person dies.
So I suppose that it's about being mindful of the changes that the kind of the death and the illness are going to bring for the young person when they are kind of having a significant loved one go through that, and making sure that they're prepared in advance for that, and so they can kind of be ready for those changes as and when they occur. Okay. So I suppose my next question is then, Kath, how should we respond to our children and young people when a bereavement has occurred?
Yes, well, there are no right or wrong answers here. As I said earlier in the podcast, every child and young person is unique with their own personal set of circumstances, strengths, needs, and responses. However, there are some general rules of thumb which may help in supporting our children and young people. The first thing I think is to answer the child's questions as they arise, which may mean answering the same questions repeatedly. Answer simply and honestly and at an appropriate level for the child's understanding. Give enough information to answer the child's question, but without adding a confusing amount of detail. It's also helpful to use lots of examples to explain the non-reversibility of death, but in a way appropriate to the child's level of understanding. Where possible, use pictures and real objects to support in the explanations. Try to take a biological approach that is practical, clear, and visual, with concrete examples. For example, comparing a dead fish with a live fish, observing flowers wilting and dying. Children can be prepared for ceremonies or rituals that they may be part of by visiting the relevant places beforehand, or using photographs, or drawing up an explanatory story using words and pictures that will explain what will happen. Detail what the child is expected to do and show both what other people will be doing and saying and what will be happening around them. I've mentioned social stories previously, and these can be really helpful here. And we'll provide a link to social stories at the end of the podcast for more information. It's also important to help the child to learn how to recognise different feelings and emotions in themselves and others, as well as learning appropriate ways of expressing their feelings. You can do this by using everyday situations and events to point out different emotions in other people, for example, on TV programmes, in magazines or in stories. by using consistent and simple language to label emotions from the child's own experiences and by using pictures. Using pictures is particularly helpful for neurodivergent children, and a feelings thermometer can help a child express the intensity of an emotion. You could do this by drawing a picture of a thermometer with a rating scale at the side. Encourage the child to show where he is on the scale to rate the strength of their anger, sadness, worry, or anxiety. Similarly, using a picture of a volcano to illustrate anger and how it sometimes boils over can be helpful. Using the comic strip conversations technique can help others understand what a child is thinking and feeling, and can provide the opportunity to discuss things that the child might otherwise find difficult. This strategy can help identify misunderstandings and highlight emotions that have perhaps not been overtly expressed or that have manifested themselves in other ways. Unfortunately, in the case of a sudden death, you may need to give extra reassurance to the child or young person that this will not happen to them, and how you know this. You could say that usually only people over 70 years of age die, for example, and it is very rare for children or young people younger than them to die. However, if you do use this, think very carefully about the likelihood of them experiencing a younger person's death. So it's really important to be very, very careful around discussions regarding sudden deaths.
Some really helpful suggestions there, Kath. So in terms of kind of when we're kind of being mindful of our child or young person, what are some of the signs of grief that perhaps we may be able to identify or look out for?
Okay, so given the profile of a neurodivergent child or young person, you may not recognise their displays of grief, but I guess any difference in their behaviour may be an expression of their confusion and loss. These behavioural changes may occur immediately or a long time after the death. You may notice a recurrence of these or other behaviours at significant dates after the death, for example, at an anniversary, Christmas, or birthdays. There are recognised approximate stages of the bereavement process, which I think would be useful to share with you today. So the first is shock, numbness, and denial, which then moves on to despair, turmoil, and acute grieving. This can include feelings like anger, guilt, anxiety, fear, panic, depression, pain, disturbance in appetite, breathlessness, illness, increased need for sleep, sleeplessness, overactivity, nightmares, regression, or loss of skills. And as I've said frequently throughout this podcast, every person's experience and response to bereavement is different. So you may see none of those emotions or feelings. You may see all of them. You may see none of them. So I think it's very much being mindful of the fact that every person's experience and response is unique to them. This phase of acute grieving then moves on to the recovery phase, including acceptance and resolution of grief, when the bereaved person can think of the deceased without pain or anger and can recall the times they had together in a positive way. It's useful to remember that these stages may merge together, and not everyone will experience all of them. Your neurodivergent family member or the person you are supporting may experience confusion over why they do not see the person anymore, or anxiety about why members of the family seem to be acting differently. Again, you could use a social story to explain how people become upset and cry when someone has died, and perhaps that it is okay that they have or have not cried or shown upset.
As we know, Kath, when someone important to a child or young person dies, memory is an important part of this grief process. So how can we create memories for the bereaved child or young person?
So, as you said quite correctly, Caitlin, memories are an important part of the grief process. The deceased may be physically gone from their lives, but the emotional bond will still be there. This is particularly true when a parent or a carer dies. Memories help any child to construct a sense of who it is they're grieving for and why. And also, there's a lot at play and lots to have memories about, whether they're happy times or ones that were not so good. So how can we go about creating memories? So I'm going to just talk about a few ideas that people may want to consider in this area. So, for example, a piece of fabric from an item of clothing worn by the person who has died, carried in a pocket or made into a cushion, can be very emotive. Similarly, the deceased's favourite perfume or aftershave on a handkerchief can be reassuring for children, young people. What is a very helpful strategy, I think, is putting together a memory box of tangible reminders chosen by the child. This can help give some insight into factors and events that are key to the relationship with the dead person. Try to keep in mind the importance of concrete reminders of the person that has died. And try to include something relating to all 5 senses. A memory box, therefore, might include pictures of the person and pictures of the things that the person enjoyed. A small object that belonged to the deceased person. A piece of fabric that is associated with that person, which may have a particular feel to it. A CD of music the person enjoyed or a tape of them speaking. And something that reminds the child of the smell of that person, for example, their perfume, their aftershave, the toothpaste they used, the deodorant they used, for example. Other strategies can include listening to audio tapes of the voice or favourite music of the deceased person, which can be familiar and comforting. And also using photographs to create a timeline to spark off memories of significant events and then build the deceased's life story can be useful. But again, everybody's experience is unique to them, and what may work and be supportive to one person may not be supportive to another. So it's important that we respect everybody's unique responses and experiences.
Thank you, Kath. There's some really lovely suggestions in there. In terms of resources, is there any kind of resources that may be helpful?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, to date, there are very few resources written specifically for neurodivergent people who are going through grief or bereavement. However, I've listed a few resources there on the slide that you can see. And hopefully there'll be some useful tips in some of the resources that will be really, really helpful in supporting family members through this process.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you ever so much for joining our talk today on supporting neurodivergent children and young people with grief and bereavement. We've explored a number of things relating to the topic today around how to respond to grief, how to prepare for grief, what are the signs of grief, but please even though that you'll be supporting these young people, please make sure to look after yourselves as well in this time. It's a really difficult experience in life and a really sensitive one. So as much as you are and you will be taking care of somebody else, please make sure that you take care of yourself as well.
Absolutely.
But like I said, thank you for joining us today. We hope this talk was helpful. If you are interested, like I said, this is one talk in a series of myth-busting talks that we've done, and we cover a range of other topics, so please have a little look at those if you are interested. And as always, if you could like and subscribe and let us know if you appreciate the work that we're doing, that would be really, really appreciated. But thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and take care of yourselves.
Yeah, take care everybody.